We're talking about this because although tariffs and the trade war chaos is dominating the headlines, and rightfully so is consuming a lot of mind share for Americans because the chaos swirling around the trade war is cratering 401ks and jacking up prices and tipping us into a recession, the actual most important issue in America right now, to me, is the fate of Garcia. Because if we allow habeas corpus to fall victim to this administration, the entire premise of the American legal system and of due process that really, it predates, as you know, Glenn, even our status as a country. This goes all the way back to Magna Carta and our sense of ourselves and what it means to be free. We are going to have a hard time repairing our confidence in the legal system. And so this absolutely needs to be resolved. I think there are two scenarios that I am worried about, and I want your thoughts on the likelihood of both of them and actions thereafter. The one scenario, call this the Wall Street Journal scenario, which is to say the Supreme Court sort of allows the administration to claim that this is a foreign policy issue, not a due process issue, right? And the reason I call that the Wall Street Journal scenario is that the Wall Street Journal wrote an editorial basically saying, oh, these judges, they should stop wagging their finger at the executive because the executive runs foreign policy, and this is now a foreign policy issue. I think that is nonsensical. This is not a foreign policy issue. This is a due process and habeas corpus issue. But that is one scenario where he actually listens to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court grants the executive yet another bounty of power after giving him official immunity a couple of years ago. The second scenario, the one that you referenced, is the Supreme Court, in conjunction with the federal lower courts, gets more muscular and says, no, bring this guy back. And Donald Trump says, can't do it. And the Salvadorian president says, won't do it. And then you have just an absolute refutation of a court order. Both of those, to me, are crises. I'm not sure which one's worse, but they would merit different responses.
I couldn't agree with you more that the claim that this is, some sort of a foreign policy or diplomacy matter when the Trump administration basically snatched up Mr. Garcia, deprived him of his Fifth Amendment due process rights, of notice and opportunity to be heard before our government acted against him, stuffed him on a plane, directed that he be imprisoned in El Salvador, and we are footing the bill. That prison in El Salvador is an extension of what the Trump administration is doing. And by saying this is the foreign policy prerogative of a president of the United States, to me, is both laughable and insulting. But I tend to agree with you, at least your suggestion, that I think the Supreme Court may flinch again because they have done nothing but flinch in Donald Trump's favor, whether it was when he was found to be an adjudicated insurrectionist and when that case landed at the Supreme Court's door, they found a way around the expressed language of the 14th Amendment's disqualification clause. When he was being, indicted and potentially prosecuted up and down the Eastern Seaboard, the Supreme Court found a way to grant him presidential immunity, which is contradicted in at least two places in the Constitution, most notably the Take Care Clause to faithfully execute the laws of our country, kind of the polar opposite, as you have immunity and impunity to violate all the laws of our nation. But if I had to bet a buck, which is my betting limit, I would say the Supreme Court might flinch again and find a way to say, you know what, we disapprove of it. Moving forward, you need to give everybody their due process rights, but we're going to close one eye and pretend like this is a foreign policy matter.
Is Amy Coney Barrett the swing vote on that, do you think?
She may be. And listen, both Justice Coney Barrett and Justice Roberts have crossed over recently, right. For example, in the USAID $2 billion case where, contractors had delivered goods and performed services under binding federal contracts, and Donald Trump tried to stiff them. At least we had Roberts and Coney Barrett crossing over there. I hope the Supreme Court doesn't have an appetite to kind of give up our democracy to somebody who's said he wants to be a dictator on day one. And I think he is proving that every day that he's been in office.
Because what happens then if they grant him this, as you said, they flinch? And, he's already said a couple days ago, next we're going to go to the homegrown criminals, right? And so he's clearly outsourcing the carceral system and outsourcing due process, or rather negating due process. It starts with immigrants, right? Because he wants to pick on those who have the least political capital. But it isn't going to end there. Why not political opponents? Why not lawyers who are on the opposite side of him on cases? Why not business interests who are irritating him? Why not opposition politicians, right? right?
Unfortunately, that's probably the perfect question, because if the Supreme Court flinches, they will be setting precedent. Now, depending on the opinion they issue, we don't know if it will be actual precedent or it will be what I call atmospheric precedent if they flinch and just let him get away with it.
Right.
But they will be sending a signal unmistakably that the Trump administration can snatch up anybody they want without honoring their due process rights, send them to prisons in foreign lands, and there will be absolutely no remedy, not in the courts, not in Congress, and not among the American people who are now being not just victimized, but intimidated and potentially brutalized. They will be encouraging that behavior if they flinch and they allow this.
And I think it's so important, given that how we talk about this issue, because what Donald Trump and his crew want Democrats to do is talk about the issue through the lens of immigration, because they know that, frankly, Americans don't trust Democrats on the question of immigration. I can talk for an hour about, what I think we should do and how to fix that, but the point is they don't. And so they are choosing the terrain of the debate on the terrain that's very favorable for them politically, and then it's harder to get key points across. My view is Democrats have to argue about this through the lens of freedom. If you are free in this country, it means that if your feet touch American soil, the arbitrary power of the state cannot be brought to bear against you without you getting to stand in front of a judge and argue your facts in front of the impartial application of law. That is freedom. And that freedom applies to everybody in this country, whether you are the president or you are a new arrival here without documentation. That's what it means to be free. We have to take the freedom frame from Republicans and not allow them to force us to debate them on terrain about border security or gangs.
It's a great point. And I think social media and independent media is perhaps doing a better job. And I think the members of Congress, the Democrats, are beginning to do a better job on that important messaging. Let's go to your second scenario, though.
Yes.
What if the Supreme Court says do it and Donald Trump says nope? Now we are in full-blown constitutional crisis territory. I'm not somebody who has been saying all along, this is a constitutional crisis. This is a constitutional. Now, I feel like our Constitution has been in crisis virtually every minute of every day Donald Trump has been in power. And I don't say that as a political guy. I grew up in an apolitical household with a pop who was a high school football coach. We didn't do politics. And I am happy to, admit and accept, look, early on, I voted for Ronald Reagan. I voted for George W. Bush. More recently, I voted for Barack Obama. I voted for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Yes, my views have changed as I've seen these parties change, some for the better and some for the worse. But this is not about politics. If Donald Trump says, nope, I'm not complying with Supreme Court orders, or I think as Judge Sotomayor called it, an edict from the Supreme Court, we are now in full-blown constitutional crisis territory, and there's no tiebreaker. There is no one to force the executive branch to acknowledge and abide by the authority, the supreme authority of the Supreme Court. So now what would that mean? Donald Trump would basically bring an end to our constitutional construct of government and governance. And Representative, what do we do at that point? What are the members of Congress thinking and contemplating if it comes to that?
Not only is it top of mind for you and for me, I also just saw public opinion research that indicates that for a lot of citizens, the ignoring of a court order is their number one fear. So this idea that has been parried about that Americans don't care about democracy, that you can't talk about democracy or the rule of law, that's not what scrubs, you got to talk about only pocketbook issues. It's just not true. Americans value and prize and revere the Constitution of the United States, and they deeply want to see it upheld. Now, it matters how we talk about it, and it matters that we make it concrete and that we don't cry wolf, right? But it does matter to people, and I agree with you, this would be a crisis. The area that I am investigating, and I want your feedback on this, is the United States Marshal Service. The Marshal Service is the law enforcement branch of the judiciary, and it does have authority to go both domestically and abroad to execute the writs of United States courts. And I think there's a role where it probably wouldn't be the Supreme Court, it'd probably be the district court in question, would direct the U.S. Marshals to go to El Salvador and retrieve him. But I want your thoughts on the practicability of that.
I think we have to take both gloves off, and if we have a third glove in our back pocket, throw it the heck out, because the U.S. Marshal Service, first of all, I worked with them for decades as a federal prosecutor in the courts of Washington, D.C. They are a crack outfit. They're one of, I don't want to compare because I love all of our law enforcement agencies, but they're one of the best federal law enforcement agencies I had the privilege of working with. And the law, the federal law, for anybody scoring at home, it's 28 United States Code, Section 566C, Charlie, says that the U.S. Marshal Service shall, mandatory, execute federal court orders, and they shall command all resources necessary to do so, right? I believe that the U.S. Marshal Service and the many deputy marshals who populate it are rule of law men and women who will abide by that legal obligation they have. They respect the oath that they took. And now everybody will leap to the next point, which is, well, but they fall under the Department of Justice, right? So Pam Bondi and by extension Donald Trump can tell them to violate the law, do the wrong thing, do not abide by the federal law. I hope to heck they stand strong and they don't do it, and they take their oath of loyalty to the Constitution more seriously than they take the commands of a corrupt president. The same way, and I don't want to jump to another topic, but the same way I hope the military holds strong. When I was an officer basic and when I went to the Army's JAG school after graduating law school, what was drilled into our heads is we must disobey unlawful orders. And I feel like Donald Trump has been itching to invoke the Insurrection Act, declare martial law, deploy military members to the streets so he can direct them to, what did he want to do in this first administration? Just shoot the protesters in the legs. And I hope to heck that the military stands strong and recalls that they are obligated to disobey unlawful orders. A tough thing to ask soldiers and sailors to do.
One of the great privileges as a member of Congress I have is to appoint young men and women in my district to the United States Service Academies. And when I call them on the phone to let them know they've been appointed, I always tell them, you are unique across most places and times in that as a member of the military, you swear an oath to the Constitution, not to an individual, not to a political party, not to an ideology. You swear an oath to the Constitution of the United States. And as you said, Glenn, they are actually duty-bound to disobey unlawful orders. And again, as with, I think, habeas corpus, the way that we're going to see him abuse the nonpartisan nature of the military is first through immigration, right? He's already taking public land across the border, adjacent to the border, and trying to get the military to occupy that on a permanent basis. But it's one small step from there to saying, well, now they have to occupy some cities through the Insurrection Act. And there's a whole bucket of law about, the way the National Guard and governor's assent intersects with that. But suffice to say, the places I would worry about most there are the blue cities and red states.
First of all, your point about the U.S. Marshal Service and that being one of the avenues that the system can go down, can use, can exploit to try to enforce court orders and bring Mr. Garcia back from that prison in El Salvador, I think is an excellent suggestion. I think we're going to all be talking about contempt of court very soon, because I think show cause orders are coming and judges will be exploring holding Trump administration officials in not just civil contempt, but criminal contempt, which we did all the time as prosecutors. When we had, witnesses or others who were defying court orders, we would often have the judge order them confined and virtually or figuratively give them the keys to the cell. I'm not saying this is the way it's going to play out, but this is an available vehicle in the practice of the law. Give them the keys to the cell and said, you can purge the contempt anytime you want and unlock your cell door and come on out if you comply with the lawful court orders. Will that ever be applied to Trump administration officials? I don't know. But let's kind of jump to the end game here, which is if Donald Trump defies a Supreme Court order or edict, just sort of, intentionally and gleefully even, what do you think is the response from Congress? And shouldn't there come a time, Representative, when we should start demanding of our Republicans in Congress, in both the House and the Senate, that they remember what the Senate leadership, the Republican leadership, did in August of 1974 when the Watergate tapes were revealed? It was the Republicans in the Senate who marched on the Oval Office figuratively and said, Mr. President, you're done. You need to resign or you're going to be impeached and removed because we cannot endure or endorse your lawlessness. That was a quaint little scandal as compared to what we're going through now. Pressure bursts pipes. And if we don't begin to put pressure on the Republicans in the House and the Senate, then we're not taking both of the gloves off. I think we're giving them a pass because so many people are like, yeah, they're never going to do the right thing. That is not a reason for us to stop calling on them to do the right thing that could potentially save our democracy.
No, it's not. And certainly I have been outspoken publicly and privately to try to get them to do the right thing on things both near term, like better oversight of the Food and Drug Administration, the measles outbreak, and of course, more macro, like stand up for the rule of law against an authoritarian president. I will tell you, though, Glenn, my second day in office was January 6, 2021. And I watched Republicans, who I know all knew that it was a free and fair election, walk back into the chamber after an insurrection and vote to decertify the election results. So the confidence that I have in Republicans in Congress to ever do the right thing against the dear leader is minimal. And I think it's important for our listeners to understand what has changed between now and then. I don't actually think what has changed is that politicians are somehow better or worse now or then. I don't tend to believe that human nature changes that much. I think politicians are about the same that they have always been. What has changed is the electoral incentives that surround politicians. In the 1970s, hundreds of seats in Congress were competitive in a general election. So the average senator, the average representative was cross-pressured to align with the median voter in their district. And the median voter in their district thought Richard Nixon was a crook. Today, of the 435 seats in the House of Representatives, only about 35 are competitive in a general election. The other 400, because of gerrymandering, because of demographic self-sorting, because of partisan primaries, are only competitive in a primary. So there just aren't politicians on the Republican side of the aisle who care what the median voter in their district think. That's not a moral statement about them. That's a political incentive statement. They just don't care. And what they do care about is what the MAGA primary voter in their district thinks about. And the MAGA primary voter really likes Donald Trump. So we're just not going to see these guys do the right thing. And in fact, the recent track record of politicians doing the right thing, Liz Cheney most notably, is that they are ostracized from the new Republican Party. The good news about this very bleak scenario I just laid out is we know exactly how to fix it. This is a soluble problem, not immediately, but in the next decade. We need state-level election reforms to ban gerrymandering and implement what New Jersey does, or a cake-cutting method has been proposed to get rid of partisan gerrymandering. And number two, we got to get rid of partisan primaries. It's got to be top two so that every election is competitive. Every politician has to care what the median voter in their district thinks.
Yeah, so you mentioned the measles outbreak, and I could talk about the rule of law all day, but let's shift over to what's going on, not only at HHS, but it feels like Trump and Musk are just ransacking our executive branch agencies, and the disrespect that they are showing the 2.1 million sort of members of the federal workforce, public servants, is beyond disturbing. It's callous, it's cruel, it is unlawful in many instances, and it's does such harm when they suggest that the reason they are, for example, firing thousands of probationary employees is for performance deficiency, when that is transparently a lie. That's just adding insult to injury. But what do you see going on at HHS and elsewhere? And what do you think Congress can do about it to try to protect the health of the American people?
What I see is a toxic brew of corruption and conspiracy. First, conspiracy. RFK Jr. is fundamentally a quack, and he has surrounded himself with quacks, people like Callie Means, who just don't believe in the scientific method and don't put any credence in evidence-driven policy. They start from a position of everyone's out to get you, everyone is corrupt, and we are the only ones who have this oracle of wisdom, and we're the first people to ever realize that exercise is good for you and junk food's bad for you. And that gives us the right to run roughshod over the Food and Drug Administration. I mean, RFK fired all of the regulators who ensure that eye drops don't blind people. And there have been instances of people having to get corneal transplants or going blind from toxins in the eye drop supply chain. We fixed it. We got some regulators. We fixed it. He fired them all. So don't know what the deal with eye drops is now. Would love it if the committee that I'm on, Energy and Commerce, would maybe do a hearing about this and ask some questions. Republicans have said flatly and repeatedly, no, they're not going to call hearings, which of course means that now we have to do this with one arm tied behind our back because we're in the minority and we can't issue subpoenas without them cooperating. So they just have abdicated their responsibility to ensure the public health and safety of the American public. But then number two is they're looking the other way on corruption, because RFK is a party to all these lawsuits against vaccine makers that he's going to stand to benefit from when he creates a false link between autism and vaccines and then opens the door to vexatious litigation. His top advisor, Callie Means, runs a benefits company on the side and is changing benefits design at HHS to enrich himself. The head of healthcare Doge, Brad Smith, was in the position of hiring and firing personnel at CMS, who are also, conveniently for him, the personnel who regulate and reimburse his own business, Main Street Health. So the amount of self-dealing and corruption when paired with conspiracy is such that we are taking a chainsaw to the U.S. education and medical enterprise that's going to, one, make Americans less healthy and safe, less confidence in the vitamins that we put in our, or the medicines we put in our body. Number two, it's going to reward snake oil salesmen at the expense of true innovators. The entire U.S. pharmaceutical industry could become just one big GNC store selling expensive urine, functionally, which is a bunch of crap people don't need. And then finally, we're going to give China a massive boost because they want to dominate biotech. They're putting tens of billions of dollars behind it. They're recruiting top-notch scientists. They're accelerating phase 1, phase 2 trials. And we're sitting here, cutting NIH funding for MIT.
You mentioned that you can't even get hearings held on these, important, potentially life and death issues that are unfolding at HHS. Recently, the House Judiciary Committee and the Senate Judiciary Committee did a bicameral hearing, and it was just the Dems. And yes. I attended it last week over at the Dirksen. And, it was really important. It was valuable. It got information out there. C-SPAN covered it. And it's like, these are the kind of hearings that I think we need to see. The Republican stonewall, I hope more committees consider taking that approach.
Glenn, I agree with you. I'm raising it with my colleagues on our side of the aisle. I agree with you. We gotta, we got to continue to put pressure on the Republicans to do their oversight and investigations job, both privately and publicly. But you're right. We I think, are moving in that direction of doing bicameral, single-party hearings because it's an emergency.
I want to talk a little bit about social media and, and even sort of writ large, the way news is delivered. Well, news and propaganda is delivered to the people of the United States. If I feel like part of the challenge and part of the struggle is that we're literally not policing any of the information that gets, poured into the public square. And if you're not operating from, at least the same basic facts, then you're not going to have much hope of talking across the Great Divide or listening across the Great Divide and coming up with, some of the best policy approaches to fix what ails America right now. But it feels like we are forever like washing our hands of regulation, of legislation, trying to, put some kind of common sense guardrails into the way information is delivered to the American people. It feels like it is a Gordian knot, but what are your thoughts about, how we can move forward on that front?
Not a single law has been passed regulating the social media corporations for 30 years. Not a single law in Congress. And in the meantime, they have become the wealthiest, most powerful corporations in the history of the world. And they have done so by attention fracking American kids, corroding their sense of self and society, and undermining civic discourse for all of us with zero accountability or duty of care to their users. And this is a problem that individual parents who are worried about their kids' screen time, local newspapers who are seeing their business models implode, cannot grapple with on their own. They're up against hundreds of thousands of software engineers who get paid a lot of money to keep people scrolling, right? Congress is the institution that needs to take on these social media corporations, but that requires that politicians find some spine. And I will be blunt, it's both parties that have this problem. I mean, Donald Trump put these tech bros in front of his cabinet as inaugural, but Democrats traditionally have also been much too close to big tech. And it's time that we peel the bark off of these social media platforms. We know how to do it. Number one, revoke Section 230. That's the liability shield they get for platforming things like cyber harassment or deepfake pornography without any legal liability. You know better than most, Glenn. If corporations have no legal liability, bad things tend to happen, right? Hold them accountable. It's not rocket science. Number two, we got to levy a digital advertising tax, which is basically, digital advertising is the way they monetize their attention fracking of Americans, right? People pay attention, they buy attention, and then they monetize it by selling it off to digital advertisers. We should levy taxes on their digital advertising revenue because they play a shell game with all their corporate income, and use that digital advertising revenue taxes to fix the things that they have broken, whether it's tax credits for hiring local journalists, whether it's one-on-one tutoring for our kids to get them back up to grade level after the school closures. Basically make these corporations pay back into a society that they have misused now for 20 years. And we also, I think, need to force the president to divest TikTok from ByteDance. TikTok is the most influential media and information platform in the world, and it's owned and controlled by a foreign adversary. And we have got to ensure that it answers to the United States Congress.
Yeah, we just can't keep worshiping the almighty dollar at the expense of everything else. And I know people will say, listen, First Amendment free speech rights are critically important to a healthy democracy. First Amendment freedom of the press, critically important to a healthy democracy, all of which I agree with. But, we can't freedom ourselves to death by being reckless about the decisions we make in the free speech arena, in the freedom of the press arena, and in every other arena. So
it's also, I think, a misunderstanding of freedom of speech when folks say that, and these corporations make this argument to me all the time. Freedom of speech is not freedom of reach, right? You can go on to Facebook or TikTok or whatever, and you can say Jake Auchincloss is a knucklehead, and I will fight hard for your right to say that as an individual. But that is not the same as an algorithm, particularly an algorithm owned and controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, that decides which kinds of content to suppress or to amplify. That's an editorial decision, and editorial decisions have long been held to standards, whether through newspapers or broadcasters, that holds them liable to tort law, for defamation, for libel, for sedition, for harassment, right? We have torts that handle these issues. We're not trying to build new case law. We're just simply saying that social media platforms serve an editorial function, and as such, they are subject to tort law.
That is such a great point and such an important point. So here's the last question. What is it that leaves you optimistic? Where do you find your hope?
I'm the youngest parent in the Democratic caucus. I got a 3-year-old, a 2-year-old, a 5-year-old at home. And so I'm oriented a lot towards little kids. And then I also, as a member of Congress, spend a ton of time talking to middle schoolers and high schoolers and college students throughout my district. Tonight, I'm going to talk to a bunch of college students. This afternoon, I'm going to talk to a bunch of high schoolers. And while it's very, every generation loves to say, oh, the next generation's a complete mess, right? What I see from these kids is real civic engagement, real self-awareness about the harms of social media and an appetite to take on the fact that they've been productized by these corporations, a healthy skepticism about politics, but also a strong attachment to democracy. And I think that we are going to see that the Gen Z and the generation after them are going to help our democracy figure out how to digest this media revolution. Because I believe that media is upstream of culture and culture is upstream of politics. And we've gone through a printing press moment in the last 15 years with how social media and YouTube and podcasts have changed how people consume information. This next generation is going to help us figure out how to have a strong civil society after this printing press moment.
I love that answer because somebody asked me that question years ago, what leaves you optimistic? And in knee-jerk fashion, I said my students. When I was teaching adjunct faculty, first at GW Law and then later GW undergrad. So I'm with you. I do think it is the younger generations that seem to understand where the weak spots are, what needs to be addressed, what needs to be fixed. And I believe they're up to the task. I want to thank you for joining us today. I want to thank you for continuing to fight the good fight in Congress, because goodness knows we're going to need, all the street fighters, figuratively speaking, in Congress that we can get as we, continue along this dangerous path of the administration defying the rule of law. Because without a healthy rule of law, we will not have a healthy or even a viable democracy, in my point. So thank you for what you're doing, and thank you for being with us here today.